Okay, hello and welcome to the Martin Center Research Seminar. The seminar is hosted and supported by the Martin Center for Architectural and Urban Studies, which is the research arm of the University of Cambridge Department of Architecture. Today, we are delighted to introduce to you Professor John Ellis, who will be giving a talk about the ideas about rebuilding our cities and neighborhoods in the post-pandemic world, sorry. And joining us in the panel today is Dr. Ying Jin, who is a director of the Martin Center. And it is very nice to see you today.
Thank you.
Before I hand over to Ying, who will introduce Professor Ellis a little bit, I would like to quickly go through what we will proceed, how we will proceed today. So we will begin with a presentation, which will last about 35 to 40 minutes. And then it will be followed by a Q&A session. You can type your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, or you could virtually raise your hand by clicking the raise hand, the blue hand button at the bottom of your screen. And if you are watching from Facebook, you can type your comments on the video, and then we will bring the questions to the speaker on here. And so that's it. That's all from me, I guess. So I will hand over to Ying.
Thank you. And Nacha, you can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce this seminar. And the students have done really well. And we have over 200 people online to listen to the seminar. And well done, the student organizers, Nacha, Kai, and Shanshan. And it's appropriate that we introduce this seminar with a eminent educator and architect, Professor John Ellis, whose work is known globally. But in this age of localism, John, I noticed that you introduced yourself as an Anglo-Californian architect, which are the two right places, right? To do. And John is actually studied in the Department of Architecture in Cambridge, and worked with lots of eminent architects here, and then moved to California, and also worked with a lot of architects, particularly in the School of New Urbanism. John, if I could say that one of the aspirations of all young architects should have this ambition to visit you in California one day, because you have a visitor's book, which is reads like a who's who in the great world of architects, modern architecture. And so we look forward to hearing from you about your thoughts on urban design and now and going forward. John.
Thank you. Thank you, Ying. What a pleasure to be able to join all of you, so many people on different parts of the world. I'm really quite in awe that so many people have joined this event. So here we are. I wore my red tie for the occasion, and I would like to start with my images. Hold on a second. And let me bring this up to full screen. Ying, can you see this?
Yes, I can read it already. Yeah.
Very good. Okay, 2020 hindsight, a vision for a post-pandemic urbanism. What I'd like to do today is just talk about how we might address how we come out of this tragic moment in our history, and what lessons we can learn from the past and past events that have occurred, and what are the images and the ideas that we can put forward for the future. Rahm Emmanual, who was the chief of staff to President Obama and was the former mayor of Chicago, said memorably in 2008, "Never let a crisis go to waste." And he said that again recently, never let a crisis go to waste. We should start planning for the future now. What he was talking about really was how to address the challenges that we face, because we're facing an enormous worldwide depression. We've got to come to grips with how to handle this health crisis, but also we've got other issues that are extremely important to address, including climate change and other aspects of that. And so if we look at the past, there are many lessons that we can learn from how we've handled dark periods in our history. Look at the 19th century in London, for example, with terrible cholera outbreaks in Dickens's London, and the sense of dread that that gave to people all over the city, and how out of that came amazing pieces of infrastructure investment and leadership shown by people such as Joseph Bazalgette, a great engineer, who rebuilt the sewer system in London, integrated it with the underground line, and built a beautiful new embankment along the River Thames, the Victoria Embankment, and left us with a fine legacy of great infrastructure. And that's a lesson for us for today. Also, if we look at the horrors of 19th century squalor, Dickens's London again, these doors, illustrations of the squalor and the poverty and the overcrowding that we saw, and how that was recorded in Charles Booth's famous poverty maps, which indicated the whole range of poverty that existed right in the heart of London in the wealthiest neighborhoods. The little chart on the right gives the different categories of wealth and poverty. At the bottom, you've got yellow, the richest areas, upper middle class, going through middle class, and then in black, showing areas which are known as low class, vicious, and semi-criminal, which is a very interesting way that the Victorians thought about the poor. And they were right in the heart of the City of London. And one area in particular, out in Shoreditch, was the site of the very first public housing building anywhere in the world, which was a response by government, by the London County Council, after it was first formed, to transform an area of abject poverty into a modern example of public housing. And they've left us with this beautiful legacy of Arnold Circus, very fine public housing buildings arranged around a public square, beautiful buildings which are still intact and now are a model for how the state can intervene and create fine urbanism. And I'll come to that later. The Great Depression now hatched the New Deal. So again, in a period rather like we're facing right now, with terrible poverty and unemployment, these pictures from the Works Progress Administration by Dorothy Lang show the misery that millions of people faced during the 1930s, and the fact that as we look at the graph, 25% of the population were out of work, and we've just recently reached about a 20% unemployment level here in the United States. So we're facing a similar terrible, terrible crisis. And how do we get out of that? Well, one of the great sources of inspiration really was the New Deal by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He and Harry Hopkins, who was his Secretary of Commerce, were responsible for an incredibly ambitious program called the Works Progress Administration, which at one stage employed the equivalent of 3.5 million Americans rebuilding the country, leaving a fine legacy of public works. If you extrapolated that to today's numbers, that would be the equivalent of 8 to 12 million people working for the state. And this is what they were doing. There was the Civilian Conservation Corps and other programs which created opportunities, gave people back employment, dignity, hope. And there's a source of great inspiration for us as we face the similar crisis right now. Think of what the New Deal built. Great infrastructure projects such as the Bonneville Dam in Oregon, which powered the Northwest, or here in the Bay Area where I live, the construction of the San Francisco Bay Bridge in 1936, an incredibly important piece of infrastructure that connected the East Bay to San Francisco, and is now one of the primary artifacts of our infrastructure connecting different parts of our region. It's interesting that when the bridge was first built, it had trains on the lower level, and it carried more people then than it does now with cars on both levels. Also, throughout the country, there was examples of beautiful public works that have left us with a legacy of great public buildings. You know, again, here in the Bay Area, we have buildings like the Alameda County Courthouse, or in Berkeley, the beautiful Rose Gardens. So there were all types of constructions that were built through the Works Progress Administration, public work projects, that provided work for people and left us with great benefits for the future. And throughout the whole country, there were post offices built, really fine, beautiful buildings. So these are ideas that we can think about in terms of how we might reconstruct ourselves out of this current crisis. So will the COVID-19 hatch a Green New Deal? We face numerous additional problems, rising inequality, the homeless crisis, which is desperate in many, many cities, including my own San Francisco and down in Los Angeles. We've got the climate challenge in terms of the great fires that have been created. This is images of California last summer. And of course, we have sea level rise, which is occurring year by year, much more realistically. And the current leadership really doesn't seem to be the way forward. So we've got to put our hope, I think, in alternatives. And there's a lot of discussion now about the Green New Deal, which at this stage is a rather vague concept. But what I'd like to do would be to explore what the Green New Deal could look like and how it might be implemented, and how can it draw on the lessons from the New Deal from the 1930s. One of the issues that we have to change and challenge, of course, is shifting to renewable energy sources. This is occurring in a big way here in California. Wind turbines are being erected up and down the state, and the solar farms are being built out in the Mojave Desert. And so we've shown how it is possible to shift away from an oil-based economy into a renewable economy. We've also got to address our mobility. And when freeways were first opened, they looked like this in the 1970s, and now they look like this in the 2020s. And it's an enormously wasteful resource in terms of what it does for both the climate and the environment, but also just in terms of the lifestyle that it generates. So the next generation of infrastructure that's already under construction here in California is the high-speed rail network, which was initiated in 2008 and is under construction throughout the Central Valley and will eventually link the major cities, San Francisco, through the Central Valley, down to Los Angeles, and eventually down to San Diego. We're also investing now in public transit in terms of new infrastructure like the Portland streetcars, or in other cities, bus rapid transit networks, as we see here in Eugene, Oregon. And we're looking at how streets can be designed in a complete manner, not only for transit, but also for bicycles with dedicated lanes and for pedestrians. And we can learn from what's happened in other cities. Here, for example, is an image of New York with lots of social distancing taking place, how the streets can be returned as pedestrian environments, and taking the leadership of Janet Sadiq Khan, who was the New York Transportation Secretary under Mayor Bloomberg, who initiated a very ambitious program to shift the movement away from the automobile to bicycles and to pedestrians and public transit. Also, we've got to change our lifestyle. It's a lifestyle change that is threatening the planet. And if we look back to the period of the 1920s and 30s or so, with streetcar suburbs, with connected streets and small blocks and compact development all within a walking distance, in opposition to the current trend, the post-war trend of cul-de-sac suburbs, which are completely auto-dependent. So if one looks at what areas like the Bay Area are considering in terms of how to rebuild and address the growth in population and the challenge of climate change, development is now focused on the cities. It's focused on transit corridors and what are called priority development areas. And this map shows, for example, how the Bay Area is focusing its growth for the future in the three major cities, densifying them, San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose, and along the transit corridors, as you can see, running down through the peninsula, through the Silicon Valley area, and on the East Bay. Now, one of the ideas that has been developed recently by a very interesting man, Gil Kelly, who is currently the planning director for the city of Vancouver in British Columbia, and was formerly the planning director for Portland, Oregon, and then before that, Berkeley, has developed a concept called the 20-minute neighborhood. And that is that we should design and build neighborhoods where all the facilities that one needs are within easy walking or transit distance. They're compact. And these are neighborhoods now which are pedestrian focused, which are mixed use. In fact, the ingredients of them should be walkable, bikeable, transit oriented rather than auto dependent. They should have a strong public realm with a great street canopy of trees in terms of shade, wide sidewalks and parks and plazas. They need to be dense enough now to support local retail, a grocery store, a school, a library, health clinic, government services. They need to be mixed income. They should be places for everyone. That includes a variety of housing types, both affordable and market rate. And they should also be able to support employment at all levels, including offices, workshops, production, distribution, and repair. So when he was the director in Portland, he focused much of his efforts on the Pearl District, which is just north of downtown, formerly a big industrial area, now completely transformed into a really beautiful mixed-use neighborhood. You can see from this picture the tight urban grids, which are very pedestrian friendly, transit lines running up and down in streetcar form along the major streets, public open spaces in the form of this little square in the center, a variety of building types ranging from townhouses, walk-up stacked flats, mid-rises and high-rises, including affordable housing as well as market rate housing, ground floor retail, and all the amenities of a compact neighborhood. And the big issue here really was building it upon public transit. The Portland streetcar network was built in order to encourage this type of compact development. And most of the area here is built without any automobile parking provisions. The streets have been transformed now in terms of green streets, in terms of rain gardens, so that rainwater off the streets is cleansed before it enters into the storm drains. And another feature, this is not in Portland, but another feature of a compact 20-minute neighborhood is having mixed use. This is a picture, actually, one of our own projects in San Francisco. It's in the Mission District, and it's in an area of the city that is both a production district in terms of the offices, the workshops and factories that you can see nearby, as well as residential. So creating buildings like this that we did, this is an affordable housing project which has on the ground floor what's known as PDR space, production, distribution, and repair, workshop spaces where people can find employment and not need to commute long distances, and create a lively activity throughout the day. I want to also make a shout out now to Paul Karakusevich in London, an architect who has been pioneering the reconstruction and the rebuilding of our cities and the reintroduction of public housing. Think back to the Arnold Circus buildings in Shoreditch back in the beginning of the 20th century. That whole tradition of public housing needs to be resurrected, and there has to be a public option. And what Paul has done with his work in London and in many of the London boroughs, like this one here in Enfield and in Hackney and Islington, is to build and show that public housing is part of the choices of housing that has to be built. And frankly, it's the only way that we're ever going to be able to address a housing crisis if there's a public option. What I'd like to do now is to show 3 examples of eco-districts, because embracing the environmental issues in terms of aiming towards net zero is one of the key issues if we're going to rebuild our cities in a manner that is sustainable, both for the climate as well as for the economy. And I'd like to show 3 examples. One of them is Bedsed in London. The other one is familiar to Cambridge students, Eddington. And the third one is one of my favorite examples, Hammarby in Stockholm. Bedsed is an interesting project. It was built in about the 1990s, just around at the turn of the century, by an architect called David Dunster. A little experimental project, which is a group of housing and workshop spaces on derelict land in the suburban area of South London. But it has its own little power plant on board, so that it's localizing the production of power for heating and electricity. And it's also combining workshop spaces as well as residential spaces. And this is what it looks like from the air. The buildings now are oriented towards the south in terms of solar panels, which provides electricity not only for the dwellings, but also electric car outlets for all the parking arrangements that are necessary. The buildings have these very interesting looking thermal chimneys, which look like great parrots up on the roof, which are part of the design of the project. But also it has a mixture of uses. It's a place of work as well as of residential. Each of the little alleyways has on one side a residential side and on the other side a workshop side, so that people can live and work in the same space. And you see this in the section. The buildings are very carefully designed in terms of their environmental issues. They have natural cross ventilation. They have daylight throughout. They have all sorts of elements in terms of recycling, electricity generation, waste reuse, and such like. And the little power plant, which was originally intended to be powered by clippings from the local borough, eventually had to turn out to use natural gas instead. But the idea was an important one, and whether or not it was successful here, it's an idea which has a lot of merit on other types of projects, which leads me to Eddington. Eddington in Cambridge is a really ambitious project by the university to expand its facilities in providing new housing for students, staff, and local residents, but also creating a new neighborhood. It was led by my friend Jonathan Rose when he worked with AECOM, and is a brilliant piece of master planning in terms of environmental issues, pedestrian-focused development. It's going to be transit-friendly, and it does a number of really interesting things, including how it will expand eventually to create new neighborhoods that are with desperately needed housing for the residents of the city. And if one looks at the first phase, you can see many of the ingredients that would be the essentials of a compact neighborhood. It has, at the very outset, was built a school, a community center, a supermarket, and the little power plant, which is the district facility for the neighborhood, as we see in red here. So these elements at the very beginning of the project now were key pieces of infrastructure to make a successful neighborhood. And it's interesting to look at the little streets within this neighborhood and to see how the power plant actually is embedded into the fabric of the city. So these can be really benign elements, and they don't have to be tucked out of sight. They can really be important pieces of the public infrastructure. Hammarby is probably the most ambitious of the eco-districts that have been built in the last few years. A really fascinating case study. Built again on derelict land on the outskirts of Stockholm. It's a compact network of blocks. It has a variety of different uses within it: schools, employment, retail, and it's started out actually as a proposal for the 2004 Olympic Games. So the city of Stockholm proposed to build an Olympic village with the stadium on the corner, as you can see on the bottom right. They didn't win the games, But they did go ahead and build a demonstration project of what a sustainable community could look like, with lots of public investment and tremendously successful urban design guidelines. And the result is really inspiring in terms of what it can demonstrate can be done with this type of leadership. You can see here in the land use, the red are all the residential buildings, the yellow are the schools, which are embedded right in the heart of the community. Purple are employment areas, and you can see the transit line that runs throughout the network, linking through to a subway station connecting through to central Stockholm. So every dwelling in this neighborhood now is within 2 or 3 minute walking distance of one of these transit stops. And as a result of that, 80% of all the movement within this neighborhood is by public transit. So this is what it was like initially. It was a brownfield site, derelict on the edge of the Stowe Lake. The land was decontaminated and now has been built. And that was done in a relatively short period of time, less than 10 years, and has created an absolutely beautiful urban fabric, and lessons that I think many of us can learn from in terms of the rebuilding of our cities. It has greenways that link right the way through to the surrounding countryside, including land bridges over the nearby freeway. The blocks are small and compact, and embedded within them are neighborhood parks and other amenities. The urban framework created a very consistent pattern of streets and blocks. All the buildings are double aspect. They look into internal courtyards as well as out onto the streets. And the public spaces are beautifully designed in terms of addressing issues of stormwater management, flooding issues and such like, but also a pedestrian realm that is a delight for users, visitors, children, families, and such like. But one of the most interesting features is the underground refuse collection system, which is used to power the local power plant nearby, and is a vacuum-based system with underground pipes, and segregated different types of refuse are collected here and sucked by giant fans through to a central plant where they're distributed. And organic waste, for example, is turned into biogas, which is used to power the power plant and also to power local buses and other materials taken away for farming. And in the center of the project is what's known as the Glashuset, which is an environmental information center, so that the story about what this is trying to achieve is positively advertised so that people really understand the changes in lifestyle that are necessary to make this work. And here it is, a beautiful neighborhood looking out onto the lake, wonderful public open spaces, and gorgeous parks within it. And looking back now, one can see that big projects of this scale have had a big impact in terms of what they can demonstrate for us. And the Olympic Games over the last couple of decades have really led the way in terms of leaving really important legacy projects in terms of both infrastructure as well as facilities. Starting off with the Barcelona Olympic project in 1992, where the firm MBM from Barcelona did, I think, a brilliant master plan, which was to extend Serda's Great Grid across the city and to rebuild an area which again was completely derelict into a really fine asset, including public parks, new infrastructure, transit, new housing facilities. This is what it was like before, and this is what it's like now. And look at the legacy that that has left us. So there are lessons in terms of the large-scale ambitions of big projects like this that I think we can use on a wider scale. So this was Barcelona. Similarly, Vancouver in 2010 with the Winter Olympics built an exemplary Olympic village on the outskirts of the city facing the South Falls Creek. A beautiful compact neighborhood, green roofs, a mixture of housing types, and now a vital new little neighborhood. And of course, we've seen that in our own case in London. The transformation of the Lee Valley, one of the most polluted parts of East London, into a grand new park running along the Lee Valley, and the reuse of the stadia facilities in terms of what they've been able to transform into for West Ham and the Velodrome and the Aquatic Centre, and also the transformation of the Olympic Village now into a brand new neighbourhood. So these are the scales of development that could be of the scale of a Green New Deal program that could offer us important lessons for the future. So I'd like to end actually with a little plug of one of our own projects, which I think has demonstrated some of the ideas that we've been addressing in terms of lessons learned from the past. This is a rebuilding of a public housing project in Los Angeles, in Watts, one of the most impoverished parts of the city. It was a legacy from World War II, which was originally war worker housing for the war industries up and down the Alameda Transit Corridor, and then became a public housing development, and was always a pretty impoverished place, buildings laid out like a gulag in terms of rows, completely unintegrated into the surrounding context, an enormous area, 100 acres in area, where we were invited now by the city housing authority to become the master planners for the rebuilding of this neighborhood and the doubling of density, to transform it from being purely a public housing neighborhood into a mixed income neighborhood with affordable workforce housing, in addition to the rebuilding of the public housing. A very complicated challenge. This was an area now which had a terrible legacy of crime and poverty. One year there were 13 murders taking place in this compound. The unemployment levels were up to about 50%. And it's an area of real deprivation. And we were invited now to participate in a series of workshops and create an urban design guideline to reintegrate this neighborhood back into its surrounding context. This is the street network that we proposed, which was to reintegrate the neighborhood back into the surrounding grid complex so that the blocks were smaller, create a whole network of walkways and pedestrian paths throughout the neighborhood, build an urban fabric which had both public buildings as well as private buildings, new housing, as well as a community center, retail, and gymnasium facilities attached to the local high school, a network of public and private open spaces throughout the new neighborhood, and a phasing strategy in terms of building without displacing any of the local residents. We were fortunate that there was a 21-acre empty parcel, which had previously been an industrial parcel in the site, that was empty, so that we could build the first 250 units and move the residents in there without displacing anyone. And by doing that, we could then demolish the next phase and move people in a decanting process where no one was displaced. And so this is what the ultimate build out would be. And this is what it was like before. You can see the rows and rows of public housing buildings, all of them with bars on the windows because of high crime levels. And this is what we've been doing. We've built a street with buildings that front onto the sidewalks. They're very much like a normal California street with mixed use conditions. There's going to be a little community center over on the right. The project is still under construction. And this is what we've been doing. And I think what this shows us is that there are huge challenges ahead of us. And how we come out of this crisis, we can learn from lessons from the past. We can learn from the New Deal from the 1930s. We can embrace the challenges that we face in terms of climate change issues and the need to move towards a net zero economy. And we can use this opportunity now to plan for the future and to rebuild our cities in an environmentally sensitive way, in compact configurations, with varieties and choices for everyone. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk to you.
Thank you so much, John. Your historical perspective is greatly appreciated. And I think in this time of difficulty, and you give us this hope that we will overcome, right? And so we have done it before. However, in the process, we must not forget all the underlying challenges, which are still there, like the climate change, like the poverty issues, the polarization of income, and so on. And through neighborhood design, you have demonstrated through these projects that architects can do quite a lot to provide the conditions for changing lifestyle, for example, through the 20-minute neighborhood concept. And that, because I'm aware that there's a large group of eminent architects actually who are actually in the audience. So expect that we probably were going to have quite a lot of discussions. Nasha, how much time do you have for the discussions and so on?
We aim to finish at 4:15, so we still have.
Right. Yeah.
So I will introduce. We have.
If you could introduce the panelists, perhaps there are so many. So perhaps the best is actually I'll mute myself so that perhaps the panelists should come one at a time to talk, and perhaps that would be easier for you to manage. What do you think? So I think over to you, Nacha. So you could share this.
I mean, so we have John Munoz, who will be giving a bit of his thoughts about the subject. So I will.
Yeah, as a commentary, which would be great. Yeah.
So he'll be here in a minute, and I see some comments from Nick Ray, and I wonder if you may want to come up. If so, please raise your hands, and then I can promote you to the panel. If not, then it's okay. Okay, hi, John.
Hello, John.
You have to unmute yourself first.
John, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, long time since we worked together. John, I'm fascinated by everything that you've been talking about, but I'm still missing the response to the pandemic. I too, like you, was very, very committed to the idea of compact urbanism, of a more pedestrian environment, of mass transit, and so on. But all of those ideas seem to me to be brought into question by the whole issue of this pandemic. For a while there, I was thinking that one of the reasons that New York was such a hotbed of the COVID-19 was because of the widespread use of mass transit in New York, as opposed to, say, Los Angeles, where a lot of people are driving in cars. I'm not sure that that's correct, but I also have friends who live in New York who wait their turn on getting onto an elevator. They don't want to share an elevator. And if you live in a 24-story building, an elevator is an essential part of life. And if you look again, and I valued very much your sense of history, but one of the reasons for the Garden City movement was how dangerous it was to live in cities with tuberculosis, cholera, and all those other diseases. So I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more, not just about this as a crisis that we need to optimize, but as a very particular kind of crisis that has brought, for me at least, into question my long-held commitment to many of the values that you've been articulating here about getting back to a higher density and mixing and mingling people and so on, which is exactly what we're supposed not to do right now.
Yes, those are really important questions. It's interesting, if you look at where the hotspots in New York happened, actually, were not in the densest parts of the city, but out in Queens and places like New Rochelle. And actually, even in today's New York Times, 1/3 of all the deaths that have occurred with COVID have actually been in senior housing complexes. So density is obviously an impact, one aspect, but it's not the key one, I think, to where the challenge of COVID has faced us. But you're right, there are going to be changes in lifestyle, and we may end up moving away from, for example, open plan offices. People are certainly going to work at home a lot more. Public transit is definitely going to be impacted. And whether or not we'll ever fly in planes with 500 other people is a big question. But I think we will want to move back towards community. I mean, we miss contact with other people. We miss the ability to give somebody a hug. We miss the idea of collectively meeting in groups. So that's where I think the 20-minute neighborhood, the idea of a more polycentric city where things are dispersed in terms of all the facilities that you need in a particular neighborhood within easy walking or bikeable district, is going to be very much to the fore.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I'm deeply committed to the idea of the 20-minute neighborhood. It makes a huge amount of sense to me. I do worry a little bit about many of the images that you show, and I visited Eddington and looked hard at Eddington, about children, and whether those environments are really the kind of environments. I mean, suburbia is often looked on with great dislike, but frankly, as a place to bring up kids, it's got a lot to be said for it. And I look at these higher density environments, and I wonder, as a child grows from, say, a toddler to a teenager, it needs a gradually widening world around it. And for much of that, early stages of that, it needs supervision. And then as it gradually finds it, and that I don't see these environments conceived of as ways that allow for that gradually widening world of a child. And I think suburbia does that very, very well. Now, most of us, when we're free of our kids, would love to move into the kind of environment that you've described. But when you've got kids, I'm not so sure.
Well, it's interesting to look at Hammarby, because Hammarby actually is a neighborhood which has a large number of families. And each of the blocks actually has large garden courtyards. Very often there's a little childcare facility right next door. And so these are areas where families feel comfortable about living there. There's outdoor space. There are little market community gardens. And there are facilities for parents to leave their children during the day while they go off and work. So I think Hammarby offers an interesting example of a dense urban environment, which is family friendly.
Okay, enough. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And if anyone wants to join the panel, please raise their hands by clicking the blue hands at the bottom of your screen. Now we have some questions from the audience. So the first one is, the COVID-19 spread fast in highly populated urban areas, such as in New York City. What are the implications of this pandemic for compact urban neighborhoods? That's the first question.
Well, I think the COVID has hit all sorts of neighborhoods, all parts of the country. I think we need to address how we're going to work and move and live nearby. And that's where I think the 20-minute neighborhood of having facilities that are close by, that are within walking distance, and that one can keep a social distancing, makes a lot of sense compared to being isolated.
And someone asked if why is it 20 minutes rather than 15 or 30 minutes neighborhood? Why 20?
20 minutes is about a mile. And within that distance, you get enough people that can generate both all of the resources that you need for a grocery store, good public transit, schools, health clinics, all the elements of the community.
Okay, thank you very much. For the first case study, the London Bedsit project, is the majority of the residents working also in those accompanying workshop spaces?
I don't know the exact numbers, but I think the intent was originally that a large percentage would do so. And so the idea was to create a neighborhood that wasn't just a dormitory for people to go off and work elsewhere, but that you could live and work in the same district.
Mm-hmm.
People not need to rely on automobiles.
All right. Someone said, I noticed that all of your case studies were low to middle-rise housing for compact and more green concept. Why is high-rise building for housing not chosen?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So all the case studies that you have presented are low to middle-rise housing.
Mm-hmm.
Compact and more green concept. Why is high-rise building for housing not chosen?
Well, I think one of the things that the Cambridge Martin Centre has demonstrated actually is you can achieve high density in low-rise form. That was one of the great discoveries of Lionel March, and many of us have followed those ideas throughout our careers. So you can achieve high density in a walk-up manner, where you walk from your street up to your dwelling, and achieve higher densities, and not necessarily always have to reach for high-rise construction.
Mm-hmm. And we still have so many. Oh yeah, you want to say something?
I just wanted to raise the issue of economics. One of the reasons that we have a normative height of these buildings is for economic reasons. Typically in America, they're stick-built over a concrete base. And once you get into high-rise buildings, you're into a completely different economic realm. And you have to charge much higher rents and so on, unless you're going to subsidize them.
Yes. In California, it's referred to as a 4/1, 4 floors of wood frame construction over a 1-story concrete base, which is either retail or parking or workshop. But you're right, that is the most inexpensive way of building, the most flexible way of building. And you could achieve that all within a walk-up dimension.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Facebook. So how would you describe the interface between these neighborhoods and their immediate adjacent communities?
Well, let's see. If you look at Hammarby is embedded in the heart of the existing city. Watts project down in south central Los Angeles is again embedded in the immediate neighborhood. And in both cases, actually, what the master plan has attempted to do was to integrate these neighborhoods into the surrounding context, to create a continuous urban fabric of small blocks, integrated with public transit and other resources and other facilities, so that they're not standalone pieces, but they're part of the continuous urban fabric.
Let's see. And how will the COVID-19 pandemic change the way architects design buildings and communities in the next 5 to 10 years?
That's a big question. Yeah. And I don't think anyone really knows the answer to that. I mean, that's what we're struggling to address, the enormity of this challenge. And I think we can look to past solutions where hope was raised in other dark periods and say, what lessons can we learn from that?
I think Ian wanted to say.
Yes, Nasha, given that we have so many practice architects actually in the audience, maybe this is an appropriate moment to ask them to see how they are coping and what methods they have been using. And while they're thinking about that, maybe perhaps John, the two Johns, could actually say what they have been doing in terms of continuing working and so on, right? So I've been sort of invited to some seminars in the Bay Area on what actually happens in the future. And I was startled by one claim that the surveying by drones and so on are now so good that it's almost making the site visits optional for some of the visits. So things like that. So maybe you could talk a little more about what you have done in the past few months, right? Well, actually, it feels like a few months.
Very quickly. I think I was really fascinated by John's historic review. I personally have been looking a lot further back in history. In fact, I spent quite a bit of time this last year with a bunch of archaeologists looking at very, very early cities and asking if there were lessons to be learned from those cities. But my own particular work, because Phoenix is a desert city, has been looking at ancient desert cities. And I sent John, which he probably hasn't had time to look at yet, a piece that I wrote about making desert cities, drawing many lessons from the pre-industrial Islamic cities. And I think, we don't need to just look at 19th century public housing. I mean, I think there are other places to look beyond that for hints as how to handle this. So I think this is a time to open the book and look far and wide for good lessons to be learned from the past. And of course, pandemics were part of the past. The whole of the West was devastated by a bubonic plague, and it had a huge impact. The fire of London had an incredible effect on London. London wouldn't be the same way it is today without the Great Fire of London in the 17th century. So I think we can look a lot further back than simply 100 or 150 years.
I would agree, actually. I mean, look at what Christopher Wren was able to do in the immediate impact after the Great Fire of London, which of course was preceded by the Black Death. So terrible disasters, one year after another. And from that came out an amazing vision of what London could be. Not rebuilt in terms of his plan, but think of the legacy that he's left us with: great public buildings, churches, and also the building codes that existed from then, which took us right the way through to the 19th century.
Absolutely. I would love to hear from some other architects. Nick Ray, where are you?
We have Alex Reed, who has been, okay. If you could unmute yourself and start the video, it would be great. Are you here? Hi.
There you are.
Hi, sorry, it's Alex Reed. I've been kindly added. Thank you so much for a really fascinating talk, John. And could I say, as somebody who retired in Cambridge and enjoys coming to the Wednesday Architecture Department talks for several years, I think this new Zoom approach has the enormous advantage that people can pitch up from all over the world, which I think is wonderful. I just wanted, if I may, to say a word in defense of suburbs. And my first proposition, and it's really picking up a point John Mernier made, that at different stages of life, dense city living or suburban living may be preferable. And that leads me to the suggestion that ideally we should perhaps offer a choice between those, so that parts of cities were dense and parts were more suburban in character, so there was a choice. But the second proposition I wanted to offer is when, John, you said, these are car-dependent suburbs, there was almost an implication that by definition, that is a bad thing. And I know that suburbs have had a very bad reputation for many years, and I think part of it is to do with CO2 emissions and the use of the car. And part of it to do with congestion because of all the traffic that's generated by daily commuting from suburbs. But it seems to me that if we look a few years ahead to when the cars are all electric and not emitting any CO2, and also as a result of COVID, I think that the idea of daily commuting may diminish substantially. And I think many firms will perhaps expect their workers to come in 1 day a week rather than daily, which would greatly diminish the congestion. So, I mean, there may be other drawbacks of suburbs, but those two drawbacks of CO2 emissions and congestion, it seems to me that those are going to diminish substantially. And so the advantages of suburbs, of having your own garden and more green space, the garden city kind of advantages, maybe would come to the fore again.
I think you're right. I think, you know, Letchworth will see a new light. The garden suburb idea has got a lot of merit to it. I can see myself actually working at home from now on and coming into the office maybe once a week. We've already found the benefits of Zoom have been enormous in terms of the ability to have people from all over the world participating in design reviews. I ran a studio the other day and I had Jonathan Rose from London, Mike Dennis from Boston, as well as local architects. And one would never have been able to have had something as spontaneous as that under normal circumstances. So we're going to change the way we operate, we're going to change the way we live. And I think the suburban model has a lot of merit to it. If it's done in a compact, walkable way, that's as an alternative to sprawl. I mean, the sprawl has been the curse of the sort of post-war suburban pattern, but the compact, little pedestrian-focused suburban neighborhoods have a lot of merit to them, and we should look at them as case studies for the future.
Great, thank you very much. Maybe Nick Ray, you want to say something?
Well, just very briefly, welcome. I've put a virtual background in the back, but I am in fact sitting inside the house that you see. So that's why I put the picture. I thank you very much for your talk. I think it is fantastic. I have some of the same worries about that John Monnier has, particularly about public transport, unless we have a vaccine which actually, you know, changes that. And we've somehow changed our perceptions. I've got 2 points I think I'd like to make. One is on housing typology. I think that the British, we know from a long history, you know, Summerson's books and so on, and George in London, the terrace house typology, which gives the advantage in relation to children's play of the small garden, but also proximities and relatively high densities, not perhaps as high as the 4-story, you know, walk up above the solid base that you were talking about. But I think that is denser than the garden suburb, and the garden suburb, to my taste, is not dense enough. You know, it's privilege. A Hampstead garden suburb or the garden cities, they become a sprawl which in a densely populated country is not so affordable. We shouldn't be doing that. That's my hunch. I've always disagreed with Martial, people like that, and not had the evidence to back it up. So that's one point really I want to make. The other one is a much broader one, which is political. I think that the post-war consensus about what a society was, and you know, people reading people like Tawney, you know, Marx was not a dirty word. The idea of massive social intervention, not as a rescue package done by right-wing governments just because there's nothing else to do, but actually as an ideal, that no longer pertains in the West. And I think that makes this situation a rather different one. That's my second.
Very interesting point, actually. I mean, this could be one of those sea change moments in our history, because we see how inept, you know, the Republican response has been here in this country. And if you think of moments of great change that have taken place in the post-war era, You know, the Attlee government in 1945 really transformed Britain in terms of creating the welfare state. And that era lasted for about 35 to 40 years or so. And then there was a period of disillusionment, and there was a sea change with Thatcherism. And that's probably run its course right now, Thatcher and Blair. And we've seen the sort of the lack of, the need for public housing, the need for public infrastructure. And that's probably going to be a big push from the progressive side of the political spectrum. And maybe this is our moment now, with the election coming up in 2020, later this year, that we may get a new Democratic administration and a Democratic Senate, and that the idea of a Green New Deal with big public investments would come to the fore. That's, I think, what we've got to hope for.
That's certainly our hope. The question is, what can architects do to further that end? I speak in the UK as well, where the present completely incompetent government has very high approval ratings, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I think, you know, architects can lend a vision of what type of environment and urbanism we can imagine, and we can push for the policies and the political effects that were necessary to make that come into fruition. We can show case studies of where it's worked from other countries. We can look to, for example, the Scandinavian countries. We can look to Vancouver, you know, in North America. We can look to examples that we say, this is how it works, this is what we should follow, and educate people in that manner.
And I think, architects obviously have a tremendous opportunity to make a contribution, but when you think about the sources of change, let's say in London after the Great Fire, it wasn't architects that did that, it was the insurance companies. Mm-hmm. And so we need to look broadly in the culture for hints and clues as to where we need to operate. I mean, London was not a brick city before the Great Fire. It was a wood city. Mm-hmm. And so we need to ask ourselves, what are the critical issues? I mean, is the COVID-19 something that we need to regard as a 1,000-year flood? Or is it going to come every 50 years? If it's going to come every 50 years, we need to be very thoughtful about the cities we build. Because look what happened in New York. I mean, it was a disaster, total disaster.
Maybe we can have another question. So we've got a question from Facebook, and it says, in the past historical pandemics like the Spanish flu, Black Death, which has caused more death and harm than the COVID-19, and after those pandemics, people would just forget. So after those pandemics, people would just forget them rather than change their lifestyle. How do you think about this? What do you think?
I don't think we're going to forget this. It's had such an enormous impact. It's caused such devastation to our economy. It has been so disruptive that this is going to be one of the big events of the 21st century. And it's going to change us. And we don't really know yet how that's going to play out. But we've got to be ready to plan ahead, which is where I go back to Rahm Emmanuel's comment, don't let this crisis be wasted.
Maybe, does anyone want to add something? Maybe Alex?
Yeah.
Can I add just one more before I go?
John, yeah, please.
It's already been mentioned, and John mentioned it. The thing that we're doing today is mind-changing for me. I mean, I have never had to use Zoom before. It's been available, but I've always thought of it as a third-rate option compared with a physical encounter. Designing to fully incorporate cyberspace with physical space seems to me a really interesting challenge. And you know, we've begun to think about it, but boy, we really think a lot more about it. And we're having a wonderful opportunity to have a big rehearsal right now.
Yes, I think you're right. We're getting better at it.
And more specifically, the two Johns. How content are you with? Professor John Ellis would be very content of this 20 minutes neighborhood. So, do you think that that realm, that local realm, is going to increase its importance as we go forward?
Let me get my 5 cents in because I got to leave. Up until 2 months ago, it was the answer for me. Now I am absolutely not sure.
It would be quite good actually to get a sense from the broad audience to see what people think, because this is one of the things we're looking at. Currently, we're doing some work at the Martin Center for the Royal Society's Rapid Response Program, looking at how to open up the country again. So clearly there are things that one needs to change. And the question is, we don't yet have very good data yet. And we could see that in the UK at least, the first infections happened in the posh areas. Largely, I think people skiing and sort of brought it back. And now they're moving to some of the more deprived areas, and also clearly there was a big disaster area in some of the, only some of the social care places. The problem is that we don't have the complete infection data yet, and although the death numbers actually could already give us a kind of a glimpse of what might be happening. So going forward, there's quite a lot to learn yet. So we're building through this monitoring program to learn and perhaps to improve our analytics actually to predict what's going to happen next.
If you want to add a comment.
Florian?
Yes, I would like to add something to what John Meunier mentioned. I myself, I live and work in New York City as a technologist. With a group of colleagues, we help companies use and build digital infrastructures. And in the last 2 months, we're busy enabling remote work. I believe that how this pandemic and its response might influence architecture and urban planning might be in big part to do with the amount of commuting, the way we work. Obviously, Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter, has just announced that Twitter employees can work from home indefinitely. I think we will see much reduced need to commute for many industries, not all. And one of the challenges is to address the necessary separation of workspace from living space. Now that everybody's work from home, we don't always find that environment to be most conducive. And we'd have to incorporate the need to work from home into our architecture and our life planning. That's my perspective, 2 cents from New York.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could pick up on that about the telecoms, which is that we've been speculating about the effect COVID might have on the physical form of the city. But it seems to me there are 2 other aspects of the city that it will impact. One is the telecommunications infrastructure. And one could well imagine, and it wouldn't be, I don't think, controversial, that there would need to be big investment in the future in high-speed broadband, and maybe even the Labour Party at the last election had a policy of free broadband for all. It didn't win the election, but it was a policy in their manifesto. But the other, and could I just pick up on the point about working from home, that I could imagine if telecommunications are more heavily used, not just for work, but also for recreation, that there could be a new kind of room in the house, which perhaps could double with a spare bedroom, which was a communicating room that could be used during the day for work, but perhaps in the evening for much richer entertainment experiences, of enjoying opera or theatre remotely. So I think there could be an impact on the accommodation within the home. But the last point I was going to add, which I think is the most vexing, is about surveillance. That one of the lessons I draw from the terrible death toll this time around is that the data on who is infected and where they are and what they are doing and who they're in contact with is very, very poor. And I think that if we want to be ready for the next pandemic, rather as the Chinese have done, it may be the most effective thing is not to redesign all our physical cities or even change our way of life greatly, but to have a very intense surveillance and testing, and perhaps even remote testing that, they will develop tests where as you walk by, it could test you. Now, all of that has privacy issues, intrusion issues, data protection issues that are extremely vexing. But you could argue that the best way to combat a future pandemic is to have a kind of intelligent surveillance city that can beat the virus at its own game.
Yeah. Well, you've seen, how the UK responded after the IRA bombings, and London became the most surveyed city anywhere in the world. On average, you're observed up to 30,000 times every time you walk down the street or enter a supermarket or a subway station. And that's become part of the normal pattern of life. And maybe that's the way we will move. But you're right, there are big civil rights issues that need to be addressed.
I have to go. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, John.
So much. Yeah, I'm aware of the time. I think we have to wrap up here. There's still some more questions, but I will forward them to the speaker. And so if you have more questions, just just send us an email, and then we will make sure that the speaker got your questions. You want to say something before we end here?
John?
Okay, well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present some ideas and address, some of the big challenges that we face with this terrible crisis. But I hope that the ideas I put forward in terms of the lessons that we can learn from previous periods, dark periods in our history, and how hope's come out of that, particularly the lessons about what we did in America here in the New Deal. I think there are valuable lessons that can be applied as we move forward in this crisis. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation and for your time today. I think we can sign off here, and so thank you so much everyone for joining us, and then we'll be back again in a couple of weeks. So we will have a break next week, and we will come back the week after with more interesting lectures to come. So that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone. I'm off for breakfast.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.